The rifle shot cracked through the still morning air, sending a flock of startled birds into flight from the cottonwoods along the creek. Julia Calloway flinched, her hands tightening on the worn leather reins as her mare danced nervously beneath her. The sound had come from somewhere in the direction of Town Redemption, they called it, though Julia had yet to find any there. It was 1878, and the Wyoming Territory was still wild in ways that made a woman traveling alone vulnerable to dangers both natural and man-made. Julia had been on the trail for nearly 2 weeks, her destination a small homestead left to her by an uncle she'd never met. The lawyer's letter had arrived 3 months after her parents' deaths from fever back in Pennsylvania, offering an unexpected lifeline when she had nothing left. The sun beat down mercilessly as Julia urged her horse forward, the wagon with her meager possessions creaking along behind them. Her throat was parched, her water supply dwindling to almost nothing. She needed supplies, information, and perhaps a night's rest in a real bed before continuing to the property. But the sound of gunfire made her hesitate at the ridge overlooking Redemption. From her vantage point, the town looked like so many others she'd passed through a single dusty main street lined with false-fronted buildings. A few side streets with scattered homes, a small church whose white steeple seemed to pierce the vast blue sky. Ordinary enough, yet Julia's stomach knotted with apprehension. She was no fool. A woman alone invited trouble in places like this, especially one dressed as she was in her plain traveling clothes, clearly not a prostitute but obviously without protection. The stories she'd heard during her journey west had only reinforced her caution. "Wouldn't go down there if I were you, miss." The voice startled her so badly she nearly fell from the saddle. Julia whirled to find a man on horseback approaching from a stand of pines, leading a pack-horse laden with what looked like animal pelts. Her hand moved instinctively to the small derringer hidden in the pocket of her skirt. "I mean no harm," he said, raising one hand, the other still holding his reins. "Just offering some friendly advice. Tensions are running high in town today." Julia studied him warily. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of summer sage. His clothes were trail-worn but clean buckskin jacket despite the heat, dark trousers and boots that had seen many miles. The Stetson on his head was pushed back slightly, revealing thick chestnut hair that curled at his collar. He wasn't conventionally handsome, but there was something compelling about his features, a quiet strength that drew her eye. "What sort of tensions?" she asked, her voice rusty from disuse. She'd spoken to few people on her journey, preferring solitude to potentially dangerous encounters. "Range war brewing," he answered, guiding his horse closer but still maintaining a respectful distance. "Cattlemen and sheep farmers. That shot you heard was probably just someone letting off steam, but it could get worse before it gets better." Julia's heart sank. She needed those supplies, needed information about her uncle's property. "I have business in town," she said. "It can't be helped." The man nodded slowly, his eyes taking in her wagon, her travel-worn appearance, and the tension in her shoulders. "I'm heading in myself," he said after a moment. "Name's Ethan Northrop. I run cattle up in the high country, but I do some trapping in the off-season." He gestured to the pelts, "bringing these in to trade." "Julia Calloway," she replied, the name feeling strange on her tongue. She'd barely spoken it aloud since leaving Pennsylvania. I've inherited property near here, my uncle's homestead." Something flickered in Ethan's eyes, recognition, perhaps. "Calloway land. That would be old Thomas Calloway's place out by Cottonwood Creek." Julia nodded, surprised. "You knew my uncle." "Everyone around here knew Thomas," Ethan said with a slight smile. "Good man, kept to himself mostly, but fair in his dealings. When he passed last winter, folks wondered what would become of his place." Last winter. The lawyer's letter had taken months to find her. Julia swallowed hard, trying not to think about what state the homestead might be in after standing empty for so long. "I need supplies before I head out there," she said. "And perhaps someone who can tell me more about the property." Ethan studied her for a long moment, then glanced toward town. "I can tell you what you need to know," he offered. "And I can point you to the general store. Mrs. Gardner runs it, she's good people. Won't try to cheat you just because you're new." Julia hesitated. She'd learned to be cautious of men's offers of help, but there was something about Ethan Northrop that didn't set off the same warning bells as others she'd encountered. Still, she'd be a fool to trust too quickly. "I appreciate the information, Mr. Northrop, but you're afraid to walk into town," he stated simply, no judgment in his voice. With good reason, considering. Julia stiffened, pride momentarily overcoming caution. "I'm not afraid, merely cautious." The corner of Ethan's mouth lifted in a half-smile. "Smart, then. But still, a woman alone draws attention, especially one as—" He seemed to catch himself, clearing his throat. "What I mean to say is, I'm heading in anyway. I'll walk beside you proudly if you'll allow it." The unexpected gentleness in his offer caught Julia off guard. She searched his face for any sign of deception or hidden motives, but found only straightforward concern. "Why would you do that?" she asked bluntly. "Because Thomas Calloway once did the same for me when I was new to these parts," Ethan answered, his voice quiet but firm. "And because it's the right thing to do." Julia considered her options. She could wait until dark and try to slip into town unnoticed, but that carried its own risks. She could attempt to find her uncle's property without supplies, but that was foolhardy at best, potentially fatal at worst. Or she could accept this stranger's offer of protection, keeping her wits and her daring about her. "Very well, Mr. Northrop," she said finally. "I accept your escort." "Ethan," he corrected with a nod. "Nobody calls me Mr. Northrop except the banker when he's trying to convince me to take out a loan." Despite herself, Julia felt a smile tug at the corners of her mouth. "Ethan, then." As they rode side by side down toward Redemption, Julia couldn't help but notice how people on the street paused to watch their approach. The tension was palpable even from a distance, men standing in tight groups, conversations halting mid-sentence, hands resting too casually near holstered weapons. "Follow my lead," Ethan murmured as they reached the outskirts. "And don't look nervous even if you are." "I've faced worse than a few unfriendly stares," Julia replied, though her dry mouth belied her confident words. "I don't doubt it," Ethan said with an appraising glance. "A woman traveling alone across country has seen her share of troubles." They rode down the main street at an unhurried pace. Julia was acutely aware of the eyes tracking their progress, some curious, some hostile, some calculating in ways that made her skin crawl. She sat straighter in her saddle, chin lifted, presenting an outward calm she was far from feeling. Outside the saloon, a group of men in dusty cattle gear watched their passing with particular interest. One of them, a heavy-set man with a bushy mustache, stepped forward as they approached. "Northrop," he called, his voice carrying a note of challenge. "Didn't expect to see you in town today." Ethan reined his horse to a stop, gesturing for Julia to do the same. "Bradford," he acknowledged with a curt nod. "Just bringing in some pelts and helping Miss Calloway here get settled." The name Calloway caused a ripple of murmurs through the group. Bradford's eyes narrowed as he looked at Julia. "Calloway, is it? Any relation to old Thomas, his niece?" Julia answered before Ethan could speak for her. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I've inherited his property." Bradford exchanged looks with his companions. "Have you now? Interesting timing, considering." "Considering what, Mr. Bradford?" Julia asked, meeting his gaze directly. "Considering nothing that need concern you today," Ethan cut in smoothly. "Miss Calloway has had a long journey and needs supplies before heading out to her property. If you'll excuse us." Bradford stepped back, but his eyes remained cold. Sure. Welcome to Redemption, Miss Calloway. I'm sure we'll be talking real soon about that land of yours." As they moved on, Julia leaned slightly toward Ethan. "What was that about?" "Politics," Ethan replied grimly. "Your uncle's land sits on a contested area. Bradford and his cattle-baron friends want it for grazing. The sheep farmers want it for their flocks. And the water rights to Cottonwood Creek make it even more valuable. Julia felt a chill despite the heat. And where do you stand in this conflict, Mr. Northrop? Ethan, he reminded her. And I stand for folks having the right to work their own land as they see fit, so long as they don't harm others doing it. He guided his horse toward a building with a hand-painted sign reading Gardener's Goods and Sundries, which is why I've managed to make enemies on both sides. As they dismounted outside the store, Ethan took both sets of reins in one hand. I'll tie up the horses. Mrs. Gardner has a corral out back where your wagon will be safe while you shop. Julia nodded, reaching for her small purse of money, carefully hidden beneath the wagon seat. As her fingers closed around it, she noticed a man watching from across the street, lean and predatory, with cold eyes that reminded her of a snake's. Unlike the others, he made no pretense of looking elsewhere when she caught him staring. "Who is that?" she asked Ethan in a low voice. Ethan glanced over, his expression hardening. "Vince Harlow, Bradford's hired gun. Best avoid him entirely." "I had no intention of making his acquaintance," Julia murmured, unsettled by the man's unwavering gaze. "Good." Ethan's hand briefly touched her elbow as he guided her toward the store entrance. The touch was light, almost imperceptible, yet Julia felt a strange warmth spread from that point of contact. "Let's get what you need and be on our way." The interior of Gardner's store was a welcome respite from the heat and tension outside. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with everything from foodstuffs to tools, fabric to ammunition. A counter ran along the back, behind which stood a plump, gray-haired woman with spectacles perched on her nose. "Ethan Northrop," the woman called cheerfully, "twice in 1 month. To what do we owe this honor? Business and introductions, Mrs. Gardner," Ethan replied with genuine warmth. "This is Miss Julia Calloway, Thomas's niece. She's come to claim her inheritance, Mrs." Gardner's face lit up with surprise and pleasure. "Thomas's niece. Well, bless my soul, he spoke of you, you know. Said his brother had a daughter back east who was smart as a whip and twice as sharp. Come in, come in." Julia found herself enveloped in a motherly hug before she could protest, the scent of lavender and baking bread surrounding her. It was the first real human contact she'd had since leaving Pennsylvania, and to her horror, she felt tears spring to her eyes. "Mrs." Gardner seemed to sense her emotion, patting her back before releasing her. "You must be exhausted, poor dear, traveling all that way alone." "I managed well enough," Julia said, blinking back the unwelcome tears. "I've no doubt," Mrs. Gardner replied with an approving nod. "Thomas's blood, after all. Now, what do you need? Food, I imagine. That old place has been sitting empty since January." As Julia listed her requirements, flour, coffee, beans, salt, ammunition for the rifle she'd brought, Mrs. Gardner moved efficiently around the store, gathering items. Ethan stood near the door, seemingly casual, but with his attention divided between the street outside and their conversation. "Will you be staying out at the homestead alone?" Mrs. Gardner asked as she measured coffee beans into a paper sack. "I have no other options at present," Julia replied. Mrs. Gardner exchanged a look with Ethan. "It's not that the place isn't sound," she said carefully. "Thomas built well, but it's isolated and with things as they are." "I'm aware there are tensions regarding the land," Julia said. "Mr. Northrop has mentioned as much. Has he now, Mrs.?" Gardner raised an eyebrow at Ethan. "And did he mention his own place borders yours to the north, or that he helped your uncle when his health was failing last winter?" Julia turned to Ethan, surprised. "No, he didn't mention either of those things." Ethan shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. "Didn't seem important at the time. Modest as always," Mrs. Gardner snorted. "Ethan here rode through blizzards to check on Thomas, brought him supplies, even stayed with him toward the end." A complicated emotion passed across Ethan's features, something like grief, quickly masked. "Thomas would have done the same for any neighbor." "Perhaps," Mrs. Gardner agreed, "but not many would have done it for him, with all the pressure Bradford and his ilk were putting on folks to isolate Thomas after he refused to sell." Julia felt a new appreciation for the quiet man standing guard at the door. "Thank you," she said simply, "for being kind to my uncle when I couldn't be." Ethan nodded once, his eyes meeting hers briefly before returning to their watchful survey of the street. "There's movement at the saloon," he said, changing the subject. "We should finish up here." Mrs. Gardner took the hint, quickly completing Julia's order and tallying the cost. As Julia counted out the money, nearly half of what she had left in the world, the older woman leaned in close. "There's a spare room above my shop," she whispered. "Clean bed, private entrance, no charge for Thomas Calloway's niece if you'd prefer not to head out to the homestead today." The offer was tempting. Julia was bone-weary, and the prospect of facing an abandoned homestead as darkness fell was daunting. But the wariness in Ethan's posture as he watched the street decided her. "Thank you, but I think it's best if I establish myself on my own property as soon as possible," she replied. "From what I gather, delays might invite complications." Mrs. Gardner's expression confirmed her suspicion. "Wise thinking, but don't be a stranger. Come to town on Sundays if you can, church service in the morning, community dinner after. Good way to meet the decent folks around here." As they loaded Julia's supplies into her wagon, Ethan remained vigilant, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. The sun was past its zenith now, beginning its slow descent toward the western mountains. "We should get moving," he said, securing the last sack of flour. "It's about 5 miles to your place. We'll want to arrive before dark." Julia couldn't help but notice his use of we. "You're coming with me, just to get you settled," Ethan clarified. "Make sure everything's in order, then I'll head back to my own place before full dark." She wanted to refuse, to prove she could manage alone, but practicality won out over pride. That would be appreciated. They left Redemption much as they had entered side by side, under the watchful eyes of the townspeople. Julia felt the weight of those stares, particularly from Vince Harlow, who had moved to stand beside Bradford outside the saloon. Their whispered conversation and the way their eyes followed her wagon sent a chill down her spine. "Keep riding," Ethan murmured. "Don't look back." Julia complied, focusing on the road ahead as they left the town behind. Only when the buildings had disappeared around a bend did she allow herself to relax slightly. "Will they follow us?" she asked. Ethan considered the question. "Not today. Bradford likes to play things smart, or what he considers smart. He'll wait, try to figure out your intentions first." "My intentions are simple," Julia said firmly. "To claim what's legally mine and make a life for myself." "Nothing's simple out here," Ethan replied, "especially when water and good grazing land are involved." He glanced at her. "You should know, your uncle died because he refused to sell his property. The official story is he succumbed to winter illness, which is partly true." But the strain of fighting off Bradford's pressure didn't help. Julia absorbed this information, a cold anger settling in her chest. "Are you warning me that I might meet the same fate?" "I'm telling you so you understand what you're walking into," Ethan said. "Knowledge is protection in its way." They rode in silence for a time, following a rutted trail that wound through rolling grasslands dotted with sagebrush and occasional stands of cottonwood trees. In the distance, mountains rose blue and massive against the sky. Despite her concerns, Julia found herself captivated by the wild beauty of the landscape. "It's different from Pennsylvania," she said finally. "Bigger somehow, more unforgiving," Ethan supplied, "but worth it if you're willing to work with the land instead of against it." "Is that what you do on your ranch?" Ethan nodded. "Try to, at least. I run fewer cattle than Bradford thinks I should, rotate my grazing areas, leave the riparian zones to recover. Makes me less profit in the short term, but the land stays healthy." "And that makes you unpopular with men like Bradford." "That, and the fact that I don't believe a man's worth is measured by the size of his herd or his bank account," Ethan replied with a wry smile. "Makes me suspect in certain circles." As they crested a small rise, Ethan pointed ahead. "There. See where that line of cottonwoods curves? That's Cottonwood Creek. Your uncle's place now is just beyond. Julia squinted against the afternoon sun. In the distance, she could make out a dark smudge against the landscape that gradually resolved into the shape of buildings as they drew nearer a cabin, a barn, and what appeared to be a small corral. "It's not much to look at," Ethan said, "but it's good land. Thomas chose well." Julia felt a strange mixture of anticipation and trepidation as they approached. This was her inheritance, her future, yet it belonged to a past she had never known. What awaited her in that weathered cabin? What ghosts, what memories, what challenges? As they drew closer, details emerged. The cabin was larger than it had first appeared, built of sturdy logs with a stone chimney at one end. The barn was weather-beaten but intact, and beyond it stretched fenced fields where wild grasses now grew tall in the absence of grazing animals. A vegetable garden, gone wild with weeds, stood near the cabin. "He had chickens and a milk cow," Ethan said as they rode into the yard. "Neighbors took them after he passed. The chicken coop is still sound, though, if you want to start your own flock." Julia nodded, unable to speak past the sudden lump in her throat. This had been her uncle's life's work, and now it was hers, both the opportunity and the responsibility. Ethan dismounted first, coming around to help her down from her wagon. His hands were strong and sure at her waist, lifting her effortlessly to the ground. For a brief moment they stood close, his hands lingering perhaps a second longer than necessary before he stepped back. "Let's check the cabin first," he suggested, his voice gruff. "Make sure everything's in order." The cabin door was secured with a simple latch. Inside, dust motes danced in the shafts of late afternoon sunlight that streamed through the windows. The main room was surprisingly spacious, with a stone fireplace at one end, a rough-hewn table and chairs in the center, and a curtained alcove that presumably held a bed. Shelves lined one wall, holding books, tools, and household items. Everything was neat but covered in a fine layer of dust. "He was a reader," Julia murmured, moving to examine the books, a mix of practical manuals, history, and literature. "Said it kept him company through the winters," Ethan confirmed. "There's a cellar trapdoor under that rug by the hearth. Should still have preserves from last year's garden, if you're lucky." Julia lifted the corner of the worn rug to reveal a wooden trapdoor with an iron ring handle. "I'll check later. What about water?" "Wells out back, good clean water, and you've got the creek for irrigation." Ethan moved to one of the windows, wiping dust from the glass with his sleeve. "Smoke coming from my place," he observed. "My foreman must have a fire going for supper." Julia joined him at the window. In the distance, perhaps a mile away, she could see another homestead larger than this one, with several outbuildings and corrals. A thin column of smoke rose from its chimney. "Is it comforting or disconcerting to have neighbors so close?" she asked. "Depends on the neighbors," Ethan replied with a hint of a smile. "In this case, I'd like to think it's comforting. I keep an eye on this place when I can. If you need help, a shot in the air will bring me or one of my men." The simple offer of protection touched Julia more than she expected. "Thank you," Ethan cleared his throat. "We should unload your supplies before I head back, and I can show you where everything is: the pump, the woodpile, the root cellar." The next hour passed in practical activity as they transferred Julia's belongings and supplies from the wagon to the cabin. Ethan showed her how to work the temperamental pump behind the house, where the best firewood was stacked, and how to secure the barn doors against wind and potential intruders. Julia listened attentively, asking questions and committing details to memory. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard, Ethan finally stopped, removing his hat to wipe his brow. "That should see you through the next few days at least. The garden needs work, but there are some vegetables still growing: wild potatoes, onions, a few carrots if you dig for them." Julia stood in the doorway of what was now her home, the reality of her situation finally sinking in. She was truly alone here, miles from the nearest town, with only the skills she'd brought with her and whatever she could learn quickly. Ethan seemed to read her thoughts. It's a lot to take in, he said quietly. But you strike me as a capable woman, Miss Calloway. Julia, she corrected him. If I'm to call you Ethan, then fair's fair. He nodded, a smile touching his eyes. Julia, then. He replaced his hat, adjusting it against the glare of the setting sun. I should be going. My men will wonder where I am. An unexpected reluctance to see him leave washed over Julia. In the space of a day, this stranger had become her only ally in an unfamiliar land. Thank you, she said, extending her hand, for everything today. Ethan took her hand in his calloused palm warm against her skin. I'll ride by tomorrow, if that's all right. Make sure you're settling in. I'd appreciate that, Julia admitted. With a final nod, Ethan mounted his horse, adjusted his load of pelts, and turned toward his own property. Julia watched him go, a solitary figure against the vast landscape, until he disappeared from view. Only then did she allow herself to truly examine the emotions churning within her: fear, determination, exhaustion, and something else. Something unexpected. A flutter of interest in the quiet, honorable man who had walked beside her proudly when she needed it most. Pushing those thoughts aside, Julia turned back to the cabin. There was water to be pumped, a fire to be built, a bed to be made. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now she had shelter, supplies, and the first fragile threads of belonging in this wild new world. As darkness fell, Julia sat at her uncle's table, her table now eating a simple meal of beans and hardtack by the light of a kerosene lamp. Outside, coyotes called to one another across the hills, their eerie voices both beautiful and unsettling. Through the window, stars appeared one by one in the vast Wyoming sky, more stars than she had ever seen in her life. So this is home now, she whispered to the empty room, testing the words, trying to believe them. The cabin creaked and settled around her as if in response. Morning arrived with a chorus of birdsong and golden light streaming through the east-facing windows. Julia had slept fitfully, waking at every unfamiliar sound: the hoot of an owl, the distant howl of coyotes, the creak of the cabin's timbers. Despite her exhaustion, she rose with the sun, determined to begin establishing routines that would shape her new life. After a breakfast of cold biscuits from her travel provisions and coffee boiled on the newly lit stove, Julia stepped outside to survey her property in the clear morning light. The land stretched in all directions, rolling prairie to the east and south, a line of cottonwoods marking the creek to the west, and the distant shape of Ethan's ranch to the north. Beyond, the mountains rose blue and majestic, their peaks still bearing traces of snow despite the summer heat. The yard around the cabin was overgrown, weeds claiming what had once been cleared ground. The vegetable garden was a tangle of cultivated plants gone wild, though Julia could make out potato plants, onion tops, and what might be carrots among the chaos. The chicken coop stood empty, its gate hanging open, and the small corral beside the barn would need repairs before it could hold livestock, so much work to be done, and only her two hands to do it. The enormity of the task before her was momentarily overwhelming. One thing at a time, she told herself firmly, echoing her father's favorite saying. Begin with what you can finish today. Water was the first priority. Julia worked the pump behind the cabin until clear, cold water splashed into her bucket. She carried it inside, then returned for more, filling every available container. Next came a more thorough cleaning of the cabin's interior, sweeping dust from corners, washing surfaces, airing bedding in the sunshine. In a trunk at the foot of her uncle's bed, Julia found linens, clothing, and a bundle of letters tied with string. She set the letters aside for later reading, unable to face them just yet. In a smaller box within the trunk, she discovered a daguerreotype of a young couple, her father and uncle, she realized with a start. They shared the same determined jaw, the same serious eyes. Beside it lay a lady's locket, tarnished with age, containing a tiny portrait of a woman with Julia's own heart-shaped face. "My grandmother," she murmured, gently touching the faded image. a connection to this place, to the blood that had worked this land before her. By midday, the cabin was as clean as Julia could make it with limited supplies. She had ventured into the garden, managing to unearth some potatoes and carrots from the tangled growth. The physical labor was exhausting but satisfying, giving her mind little opportunity to dwell on fears or doubts. She was washing dirt from the vegetables at the pump when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her straighten, one hand instinctively moving toward the pocket where her derringer rested. Shading her eyes against the sun, she spotted a familiar figure on horseback, Ethan, leading a second horse laden with what appeared to be supplies. Relief washed through her, followed immediately by self-consciousness as she became aware of her disheveled appearance, hair escaping its pins, dress damp and soil-stained, hands rough from the morning's work. Ethan dismounted as he reached the yard, removing his hat in greeting. "Good morning," he called, "or afternoon, I suppose. I see you've been busy." Julia brushed ineffectually at her skirt. "There's much to be done." "Always is," he agreed, his eyes taking in the cleared porch, the open windows, the pulled weeds piled beside the garden. "You've made a good start." "What's all this?" Julia asked, gesturing to the packed horse. "Some things I thought might help," Ethan replied, beginning to unload parcels and sacks. "Seeds for replanting that garden, some preserved food from my storehouse, tools you might need." He paused, looking slightly embarrassed. "And I brought something else that might interest you." From a leather saddlebag, he withdrew a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Carefully unfolding it, he revealed a journal bound in faded leather. "Your uncle's record of this place," Ethan explained, holding it out to her. "He showed it to me once, maps of the property, notes on planting times, weather patterns, where to find the best hunting. Thought you might want it." Julia took the journal with reverent hands. "Where did you find this?" "He gave it to me before he died," Ethan said quietly. "Asked me to pass it on if his family ever came to claim the place. I kept it safe, waiting." The thoughtfulness of both her uncle and this man before her threatened to bring tears to Julia's eyes. She blinked them back resolutely. "Thank you, this is invaluable." Ethan nodded, looking relieved at her reaction. "There's something else," he said, turning back to the second horse. "Something that rightfully belongs here." From a special carrier attached to the saddle, he lifted a cage containing 3 brown feathered chickens. "Descendants of your uncle's flock," he explained. "I took them in after he passed, thought you might want to start rebuilding." Julia stared at the placidly clucking hens, then at Ethan's face, seeing the quiet generosity there. "You've been planning for this," she realized. "For someone to come claim this place." "Hoping for it," Ethan corrected. "Better than seeing Bradford or his kind get their hands on it." The words reminded Julia of the realities beyond her property lines. "Have there been developments in town since yesterday?" Ethan's expression turned more serious. "Talk, mainly. Bradford's asking questions about you, your intentions. And I heard Harlow was seen riding in this direction early this morning, though he turned back before reaching your property line." A cold shiver ran down Julia's spine despite the warmth of the day. "Reconnaissance, likely," Ethan agreed. "Bradford won't move against you directly, not yet at least. He'll try to intimidate you first, make you want to sell on your own." Julia lifted her chin defiantly. "He'll find I'm not easily intimidated." Something like admiration flickered in Ethan's eyes. "I'm beginning to see that." He glanced at the sun's position. "I can stay a few hours, help with some of the heavier work if you'd like." The offer was tempting. There were repairs to the corral that would go faster with an extra pair of hands, and Julia had discovered a broken hinge on the barn door that needed fixing. Still, she hesitated, not wanting to appear dependent. Ethan seemed to sense her internal debate. "Consider it being neighborly," he suggested. "Out here, we all need to help each other sometimes. I'd expect the same if I were in trouble." Put that way, Julia found she could accept. "The barn door needs repair," she admitted, "and I haven't been able to check the roof for leaks." For the next several hours, they worked together with an efficiency that surprised Julia. Ethan was skilled with tools, repairing the barn door and corral fencing with practiced ease. Julia installed the chickens in their coop, then set about sorting the seeds he had brought, planning where each variety should be planted in the reclaimed garden. They spoke little as they worked, but the silence was comfortable rather than strained. Occasionally, Ethan would offer advice about the property where the best firewood could be found, which parts of the creek bank were prone to flooding in spring, how to reinforce the chicken coop against predators. Julia listened and asked questions, mentally mapping this new world and its challenges. As the afternoon waned, Julia insisted on preparing a meal from her newly acquired supplies, a simple stew of salt pork, potatoes, and wild onions. They ate on the porch, watching the sun begin its descent toward the western mountains. "How did you come to be here?" Julia asked as they finished the meal. "You're educated from your speech, not a typical rancher." Ethan looked surprised at her observation, then smiled slightly. "Harvard, actually, class of '68. My father had grand plans for me to join his law practice in Boston." "What happened?" "War happened first," Ethan said, his expression growing distant. "I enlisted in '64, served until Appomattox. After that, Boston seemed too confined, too formal, all those rules and expectations." He shrugged. "I headed west instead, worked cattle drives in Texas, then gradually made my way north. Found this valley 5 years ago and decided to put down roots." "Your family must have been disappointed," Julia observed. "They were," Ethan acknowledged. "My father disowned me, more or less. My mother writes occasionally, but I think she's given up hope of my coming to my senses and returning east." He looked at her curiously. "What about you? What brings Thomas Calloway's niece all the way from Pennsylvania alone?" Julia hesitated, then decided that honesty deserved honesty in return. "My parents died last winter, influenza. I was teaching at a small school, but once they were gone." She traced the rim of her tin cup with one finger. "There was nothing to keep me there. When the lawyer's letter came about Uncle Thomas's property, it seemed like providence." "I'm sorry about your parents," Ethan said quietly. "Thank you." Julia stared out at the darkening land. "It's strange, I never met my uncle, yet living in his home, using his things. I feel I'm coming to know him. He seems to have been a good man." "He was," Ethan confirmed. "Stubborn as a mule when he believed he was right, but always fair. Helped me when I first arrived, taught me about this land, its seasons and moods." He paused, seeming to debate whether to continue. "He spoke of you sometimes." Julia looked up in surprise. "Of me, but we never met." "Your father wrote to him occasionally," Ethan explained. "Sent a photograph once. Thomas kept it on his shelf there." He nodded toward the cabin. "He was proud that his niece was a teacher. Said you had both learning and grit, which he considered the highest praise." A lump formed in Julia's throat. The idea that her uncle had known of her, had been proud of her from afar, was unexpectedly moving. "I wish I'd had the chance to know him." "He would have liked that too," Ethan said gently. As twilight deepened, Ethan reluctantly rose to his feet. "I should head back before full dark," he said. "Will you be all right tonight?" Julia nodded, though the prospect of another night alone in the isolated cabin was daunting. "I'll be fine. I've managed so far." Ethan studied her face for a moment, then reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object. "Take this," he said, holding out what appeared to be a whistle carved from bone. "It carries farther than a voice if you need to signal." Julia accepted the whistle, touched by his concern. "Thank you." As Ethan prepared to depart, loading his empty saddlebags onto his horse, Julia found herself reluctant to see him go. His presence had brought not just practical help, but a sense of connection to this new place through his knowledge of her uncle, his understanding of the land, his quiet strength. "Would you," she began, then stopped, uncertain. Ethan turned, waiting. "Yes," Julia gathered her courage. "Would you consider joining me for Sunday dinner, after church services in town?" The invitation surprised even her as it left her lips. Something like pleasure warmed Ethan's eyes. "I'd be honored," he said. "Though I should warn you, I haven't darkened the church door in some time. Pastor Matthews has all but given up on my soul." Then we'll be reprobates together, Julia replied with unexpected lightness. I haven't been particularly observant since my parents' passing. Ethan's smile deepened. Sunday it is, then. He mounted his horse with fluid grace, settling into the saddle. If you need anything before then, anything at all, fire a shot or use that whistle. I'll hear it. With a tip of his hat, he turned his horse and rode north toward his own ranch, his silhouette gradually fading into the gathering darkness. Julia stood watching long after he had disappeared from view, the bone whistle clutched in her hand like a talisman. Only when the evening chill began to seep through her clothing did she finally turn back to her cabin now, and the solitude that awaited her inside. The next days fell into a pattern of hard work and gradual discovery. Julia rose with the sun each morning, tending to the chickens, working in the garden, and slowly transforming the neglected homestead into a functioning farm once more. She explored her property boundaries, familiarizing herself with the landmarks her uncle had noted in his journal: the bend in the creek where trout gathered in the deep pools, the south ridge that offered protection from winter winds, the natural spring that never failed even in drought years. Ethan rode by each day, ostensibly to check on her progress, but bringing small gifts each time: a sack of cornmeal, a jar of preserved peaches, a repaired lantern. He never stayed long, clearly respectful of propriety, but his visits became the highlights of Julia's days. They would talk of practical matters, weather, crops, repairs needed, but increasingly, their conversations strayed to more personal topics. Books they had both read, places they had seen, dreams they still harbored. On the third day, Ethan arrived with a milk cow plodding behind his horse. She's getting on in years, he explained as Julia stared in astonishment, but still gives good milk, better than her being slaughtered for tough beef. I can't accept this, Julia protested. It's too much. Consider it a loan, Ethan suggested. Until you're established enough to acquire livestock of your own. She was your uncle's originally, anyway part of his estate by rights. Julia reluctantly agreed, secretly grateful for the addition to her small farm. The fresh milk was a luxury she hadn't expected to enjoy for many months, if at all. On Friday afternoon, Ethan arrived with two of his ranch hands, a grizzled older man introduced as Pete, and a younger Mexican vaquero named Miguel. They brought tools and lumber, and before Julia could properly protest, they were repairing her roof, reinforcing the chicken coop, and digging post holes for a new section of fencing. You can't possibly do all this alone, Ethan said when she expressed concern about accepting so much help. No one out here can. We help each other or none of us survive. By sunset, the most pressing repairs were complete. Julia insisted on feeding all three men, stretching her stew with extra potatoes and baking cornbread in the newly cleaned oven. As they ate on the porch, Pete regaled her with stories of the early days in the territory, when only trappers and Indian tribes inhabited the valley. Your uncle was one of the first real settlers, Pete told her. Came in '62, right in the middle of the war. Folks thought he was crazy, staking a claim so far from civilization, but Thomas always said he wanted elbow room. Did he ever have trouble with the native tribes? Julia asked, curious about this part of her uncle's history. Some, Pete acknowledged. But Thomas learned their language, traded fair, respected boundaries, made peace with the local Shoshone chief after some initial misunderstandings. They ended up helping each other through hard winters. Miguel, quieter than Pete but equally observant, added, Senor Thomas, he understood respect. Not like the cattle barons who came later, taking what they want. Bradford's kind, you mean, Julia said. The three men exchanged glances. Bradford's the worst of them, Pete agreed. Came in '72 with Eastern money behind him, buying up land, pushing out smaller ranchers, bringing in gunslingers like Harlow when persuasion didn't work. Has he tried to pressure you, Ethan? Julia asked, suddenly concerned for her neighbor. Tried, Ethan replied with a tight smile. I'm fortunate to have good men working with me and enough resources to resist, Smaller operators haven't been so lucky. As the men prepared to leave, Miguel approached Julia with a small cloth bundle. "For protection," he said softly, opening it to reveal a string of dried chili peppers and a small carved wooden figure. "My grandmother's magic. The chili keeps away evil spirits, the santo brings good fortune." Julia accepted the gifts with genuine gratitude, touched by the man's concern. "Thank you, Miguel. I'll treasure them." After the men had gone, Julia sat alone on her porch, watching stars appear in the vast Wyoming sky. The homestead felt different now, more alive, more a part of her. The gifts and help she had received created invisible threads connecting her to this place and its people, weaving her into the fabric of this new community. Sunday dawned clear and warm, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of sage and wild roses. Julia rose early, bathing in water heated on the stove, then dressing in her best gown, a modest blue cotton with white lace at the collar and cuffs. She arranged her hair carefully, pinning it in a neat chignon at the nape of her neck. The journey to town felt different with Ethan riding beside her. He had arrived promptly at 8, dressed in clean dark trousers and a white shirt, his usual trail-worn clothing exchanged for more formal attire. His hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaven. The transformation was striking, highlighting the strong lines of his jaw and the intelligence in his eyes. "You look very nice," he had said upon seeing her, the simple compliment bringing unexpected warmth to her cheeks. As they approached redemption, Julia felt her earlier anxiety returning. The last time she had entered this town, she had been a stranger, unsure and afraid. Today she came as a landowner, as Thomas Calloway's niece, with Ethan Northrop riding beside her. It shouldn't matter what these people thought of her, yet she found herself straightening her shoulders, lifting her chin slightly. "Nervous?" Ethan asked, noticing the change in her posture. "A bit," Julia admitted. "I'm not usually concerned with others' opinions, but this is different," Ethan finished for her. "This is where you live now. These people's goodwill or hostility will affect your daily life." He gave her a reassuring smile. "For what it's worth, most of them are good folks. It's only a few like Bradford who cause trouble." The church stood at the edge of town, a simple white clapboard building with a modest steeple. Already wagons and horses were gathered outside, families in their Sunday best making their way inside. Julia noticed how conversations paused as she and Ethan approached, heads turning, eyes assessing. "Ignore them," Ethan murmured as he helped her down from her wagon. "They're just curious." Mrs. Gardner bustled over immediately, resplendent in a purple dress and matching hat. "Julia, my dear, I'm so pleased you've come, and Ethan Northrop in church wonders never cease." She enveloped Julia in a motherly hug, then gave Ethan a playful swat with her fan. "About time you remembered your Christian duty, young man. I'm here under duress," Ethan replied with good humor. Miss Calloway's invitation was too polite to refuse. "Well, whatever the reason, I'm glad to see you both," Mrs. Gardner said. "Come, I've saved seats in my pew." As they entered the church, Julia was aware of the whispers and glances that followed them. Some were merely curious, others openly friendly, but a few particularly from a group of well-dressed men near the front whom Julia suspected were Bradford's associates, were decidedly hostile. The service itself was simple but heartfelt, led by a gray-haired pastor whose sermon on neighborly love seemed particularly pointed given the tensions in the community. Julia found herself genuinely moved by the familiar hymns and prayers, reconnecting with a spiritual side she had neglected in her grief and upheaval. Throughout the service, she was acutely aware of Ethan beside her, the warmth of his arm occasionally brushing hers, the deep timbre of his voice during the hymns, the respectful attention he paid to the sermon despite his earlier jokes about his lapsed faith. As the congregation filed out afterward, Pastor Matthews made a point of greeting Julia personally. "Miss Calloway, welcome to our community," he said, clasping her hand warmly. Your uncle was a valued member of this congregation. We've missed his presence these past months." "Thank you, Pastor," Julia replied. "I'm learning he was well regarded by many." "Not all," the pastor said quietly, with a meaningful glance toward Bradford, who stood conversing with several men near the church steps. "But those whose opinions matter most respected him greatly." He turned to Ethan with a smile. "And it's good to see you here, Ethan. Don't make it another 6 months before your next visit." "I'll do my best, Pastor," Ethan promised, though Julia detected a hint of reservation in his tone. Outside, the community was gathering for the Sunday dinner tables set up in the shade of large cottonwood trees, women arranging covered dishes while men set up benches and chairs. Children darted between the adults, their Sunday best already showing signs of play. "Mrs. Gardner steered Julia toward a group of women, making introductions. "This is Sarah Wilson. Our schoolteacher Julia was a teacher back east, you know. And this is Mary Harmon, who runs the dressmaking shop, and her sister Emma." Julia found herself warmly welcomed by most of the women, who were curious about her journey west and her plans for her uncle's property. Several offered advice on gardening in Wyoming's climate, while others promised to visit once she was settled. "You must join our quilting circle," insisted plump, cheerful Mrs. Wilson. "We meet every other Wednesday at the schoolhouse. Nothing fancy, but it's a chance to socialize." Across the churchyard, Julia could see Ethan speaking with his ranch hands and several other men, occasionally glancing in her direction. Once their eyes met briefly, and the small smile he gave her caused an unexpected flutter in her chest. The peaceful atmosphere changed subtly when Bradford and his associates approached the gathering. The rancher was expensively dressed, his watch chain gleaming gold in the sunlight, his boots polished to a high shine. Behind him, like a shadow, walked Vince Harlow, his cold eyes surveying the crowd. Conversations quieted as Bradford made his way to where Julia stood with the women. "Miss Calloway," he said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "A pleasure to see you again. I trust you're finding your uncle's modest holdings adequate." There was something in his tone, a subtle condescension, an underlying threat that raised Julia's hackles immediately. "More than adequate, Mr. Bradford," she replied evenly. "It's remarkable what good land and honest work can produce." Bradford's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Indeed. Though I imagine a lady of your upbringing might find the isolation challenging. If you ever reconsider your position on remaining, I'd be happy to make you a generous offer for the property. Allow you to return to more civilized surroundings." Before Julia could respond, Ethan appeared at her side. "Miss Calloway seems to be adapting admirably to Wyoming life," he said, his voice pleasant but with an edge of steel beneath. "In fact, she's already making improvements to the property that Thomas would have approved of." Bradford's gaze shifted to Ethan, all pretense of friendliness vanishing. "Northrop, still interfering in matters that don't concern you, I see." "Helping a neighbor concerns everyone in this community," Ethan replied calmly, as Pastor Matthews just reminded us in his sermon. A tense silence fell over the gathering. Julia could feel the weight of many eyes upon them, watching this confrontation with varying degrees of concern or interest. Bradford clearly hadn't expected to be challenged publicly. After a moment, the rancher forced another smile. "Well, the offer stands, Miss Calloway. When winter comes and you find yourself snowed in with dwindling supplies and no man to help you, you may change your mind." His gaze flickered meaningfully to Ethan and back. "Unless, of course, you've already found alternative arrangements." The implication was clear and deliberately insulting. Julia felt her cheeks flush with anger rather than embarrassment. "I appreciate your concern for my welfare, Mr. Bradford," she said coldly, "but I come from hardy stock. My uncle survived many winters quite successfully, and I intend to do the same." Bradford's expression hardened. With a curt nod, he turned away, gesturing for Harlow to follow. As they walked toward their waiting horses, Julia heard him mutter, "She'll learn the hard way, just like her stubborn uncle." Ethan's hand touched her elbow gently. Are you all right? Julia realized she was trembling slightly, though whether from anger or delayed fear, she wasn't sure. Yes, she said, though I believe I've just made an enemy. Bradford was already your enemy, Ethan said quietly. He just hasn't bothered to hide it anymore. The community dinner proceeded despite the tension Bradford had left in his wake. Many of the townspeople made a point of coming to speak with Julia, offering encouragement and support. By the time the meal concluded, Julia felt cautiously optimistic about her place in this community. She had potential friends here, people who had respected her uncle and were willing to extend that respect to her. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Gardner pressed a basket of leftover food into Julia's hands. For your supper tonight, she insisted, and there's a jar of my blackberry preserves at the bottom. Thomas always did love them. The ride back to the homestead was quieter than their journey into town. Julia found herself mulling over Bradford's words, the barely veiled threats beneath his polite exterior. He won't give up easily, will he? She finally asked as they crossed the creek that marked the boundary of her property. Ethan shook his head. No. Your land is the missing piece he needs to control the entire watershed. Without it, his expansion plans are blocked. Why is it so important to him? Surely he has enough land already. It's never about enough with men like Bradford, Ethan replied grimly. It's about control, power. And water is the most valuable resource out here. Whoever controls it controls everything else. They reached the yard of Julia's cabin, where Ethan helped her down from the wagon with the same careful courtesy he had shown all day. Thank you for accompanying me today, Julia said, suddenly shy in a way she hadn't been before. Their relationship seemed to have shifted subtly, no longer simply neighbors helping one another, but something less defined, more complex. It was my pleasure, Ethan replied, his eyes meeting hers with a warmth that sent that same flutter through her chest. Though I'm not sure I did your reputation any favors, Bradford's insinuations. I care nothing for Bradford's opinion, Julia said firmly. Nor for anyone who would believe such things. Ethan smiled at that, a genuine smile that transformed his serious face. You truly are Thomas Calloway's niece. He hesitated, seeming on the verge of saying something more, then apparently thought better of it. I should let you rest. It's been a long day. As he mounted his horse, Julia found herself reluctant to end their time together. Will I see you tomorrow? She asked, then immediately felt foolish for the eagerness in her voice. If Ethan noticed, he gave no sign. I'm riding to the north pasture to check on the herd, he said. Might be gone a couple of days, but I'll stop by when I return. Julia nodded, trying not to show her disappointment. Be safe, she said. Always am, Ethan replied with a tip of his hat. Lock your doors at night, Julia. And remember the whistle if you need anything. With that, he turned his horse toward his own ranch, leaving Julia standing in her yard with Mrs. Gardner's basket clutched in her hands and a curious mixture of emotions churning inside her. That night, as she prepared for bed, Julia found herself lingering at the window that faced north toward Ethan's property. A single light burned in the distance, his ranch house, she presumed. The sight was oddly comforting, a reminder that despite the vastness of the landscape and the isolation of her homestead, she was not entirely alone. The days without Ethan's visits passed more slowly than Julia had expected. She kept busy with endless tasks, weeding the garden, collecting eggs, churning butter from the old cow's milk, mending fences, but found herself frequently glancing north, watching for a familiar figure on horseback. On the third day, as Julia was hanging laundry on a line stretched between two cottonwoods, she heard approaching hoofbeats. Her heart lifted expectantly, but as the rider came into view, she realized it wasn't Ethan but a stranger, a thin man on a dappled gray horse, wearing the dust of long travel. Julia reached for the rifle she had taken to keeping nearby, not raising it but ensuring it was within reach as the rider approached. Miss Calloway, the man called, reining in at a respectful distance. Name's Jim Harper. I carry mail and messages between settlements. Got something for you." Still cautious, Julia nodded. "You can bring it here." Harper dismounted, reaching into his saddlebag to produce an envelope. "From the county seat," he explained, holding it out. "Legal papers, looks like." Julia accepted the envelope, noting the official seal of the Wyoming Territorial Court. "Thank you, Mr. Harper. Would you care for some water before you continue?" "Much obliged," Harper replied, removing his hat to wipe sweat from his brow. "Been a hot ride from town." As Julia pumped water into a tin cup for the mail carrier, she asked, "Do you know what these papers concern?" Harper shook his head. "Not my business to know the contents, madam, though I did hear some talk in town that Bradford's been to see Judge Wilson twice this week." A chill ran through Julia despite the summer heat. "I see. Folks in town are taking sides," Harper continued, accepting the water gratefully. "Most of the ordinary people shopkeepers, farmers. They're hoping you hold onto your land. Bradford's not popular except with the big ranchers and those who profit from his business." "And what about Mr. Northrop? Where does he stand in town opinion?" Julia found herself asking. Harper grinned. "Ethan, he's respected. Keeps to himself mostly but treats people fair, pays his debts on time. Folks notice that." He drained the cup and handed it back. "Speaking of Northrop, I'm headed to his place next." "Any message you'd like me to deliver?" Julia hesitated, then said, "Just tell him I received some legal papers that may concern Bradford, if he's interested." After Harper departed, Julia broke the seal on the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside, she found a summons to appear before Judge Wilson in 1 week's time, responding to allegations by Wesley Bradford that her claim to Thomas Calloway's property was invalid due to irregularities in the will and transfer of deed. "So that's his approach," Julia murmured, anger replacing her initial fear. "Legal challenges rather than direct threats." She was still studying the documents when she heard more hoofbeats approaching, faster this time, more urgent. Looking up, she saw Ethan riding hard toward the cabin, his expression grim. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, striding toward her with the paper Harper had delivered clutched in his hand. "Harper told me," he said without preamble. "What does it say?" Julia handed him the summons, watching his face as he read. His jaw tightened, a muscle working in his cheek. "Bastard," he muttered. "I should have expected this." "Can he really challenge my inheritance?" Julia asked, fear creeping back into her voice despite her efforts to remain calm. Ethan looked up from the papers, his expression softening at her concern. "He can try," he said, "but your claim is solid. Thomas's will was properly filed and witnessed. I know because I was one of the witnesses." Relief washed through Julia. "You were?" Ethan nodded. "Thomas wanted to ensure everything was in order. He knew Bradford would try something like this if he could." He folded the papers carefully, handing them back to her. "We'll need to go to town tomorrow, find you a lawyer." "We?" Julia asked, catching the pronoun. "If you'll allow me to accompany you," Ethan amended. "Bradford has influence with some of the lawyers in the county. We'll need to find one who can't be intimidated or bought." Julia studied him, the dust of the trail still on his clothes, the concern evident in his eyes, the protective stance he had unconsciously adopted. This man had become her ally, her friend, perhaps something more, in the space of little more than a week. The realization both warmed and frightened her. "I'd be grateful for your help," she said finally. "I'm afraid I know very little about territorial law." Ethan's expression relaxed slightly. "Good, we'll leave at first light." He glanced at the sun's position. "I should get back to my ranch. I've got men waiting for instructions, but I'll return at dawn." As he turned to go, Julia impulsively reached out, catching his hand. "Thank you," she said simply, "for all of this." Ethan looked down at their joined hands, then back to her face. Something passed between them in that moment, unspoken but palpable, a current of feeling neither was quite ready to name. "You don't need to thank me," he said quietly. "I'd do the same for any neighbor." A pause, then, softer still. "But you're not just any neighbor, are you, Julia?" Before she could respond, he gently withdrew his hand, nodded once, and returned to his horse. Julia watched him ride away, her hand still warm from his touch, his words echoing in her mind. That night, Julia slept fitfully, her dreams troubled by images of courtrooms and grim-faced judges, of Bradford's triumphant smile and her uncle's homestead slipping away from her. She woke before dawn, exhausted but determined, and was dressed and waiting when Ethan arrived as promised. The ride to town was filled with Ethan's advice about the legal proceedings, what to expect, how to comport herself, which arguments might be most effective. Julia listened carefully, grateful for his knowledge, but increasingly aware that her feelings for this man had grown far beyond mere neighborly appreciation. In redemption, they went directly to a small office near the courthouse. The sign on the door read Franklin Pierce, attorney at law. Inside, they found a slight, bespectacled man with thinning hair and shrewd eyes sorting through a stack of documents. "Ethan," he greeted, looking up in surprise. "Twice in 1 month must be serious business." "It is, Frank," Ethan replied, removing his hat. "This is Miss Julia Calloway, Thomas's niece. She's being challenged by Bradford over her inheritance." Pierce's eyebrows rose. "Is she indeed? Pleased to meet you, Miss Calloway. I had the honor of knowing your uncle." He gestured for them to sit. "Now tell me everything." For the next hour they discussed the case, with Pierce asking detailed questions about Julia's documentation, the timing of her arrival, and her knowledge of her uncle's wishes. Finally, he sat back, tapping his fingers thoughtfully on his desk. "Bradford's on shaky legal ground," he concluded. "The will is properly executed, the deed transfer follows territorial law, and your claim as Thomas's closest living relative is clear." He paused. "But legal merit isn't always the deciding factor, especially when influence and money are involved." "What do you mean?" Julia asked. Pierce exchanged a glance with Ethan. "Judge Wilson has financial ties to Bradford's bank. He's ruled in Bradford's favor in similar disputes." Julia felt her hopes sinking. "Then we've already lost." "Not necessarily," Pierce countered. "There's enough public interest in this case that Wilson will need to at least appear impartial, and I have certain information that might encourage him to actually be impartial." "What sort of information?" Ethan asked, his tone cautious. Pierce smiled thinly. "Let's just say the judge has his own secrets that wouldn't bear public scrutiny. I've never had reason to use that knowledge before, but for Thomas Calloway's niece, I might make an exception." Julia wasn't entirely comfortable with the implication of blackmail, but she recognized that in this frontier justice system, such tactics might be necessary. "Will you represent me, Mr. Pierce?" "I'd be honored," the lawyer replied. "My father came west with nothing but determination and found good neighbors like your uncle who helped him establish himself. I haven't forgotten that kind of loyalty." As they left Pierce's office, Julia felt cautiously optimistic. They were crossing the street toward the general store when Bradford emerged from the saloon, accompanied by Harlow and another man Julia didn't recognize. Bradford spotted them immediately, his face darkening as he changed direction to intercept them. "Miss Calloway," he said with forced politeness, "I see you've received my legal notice. I hope you understand this is merely business, nothing personal." "Attempting to steal a woman's rightful inheritance seems rather personal, Mr. Bradford," Julia replied coolly. Bradford's smile tightened. "Strong words, but the court will determine what's rightful. I merely question whether a single woman with no knowledge of ranching can properly manage such valuable land." His gaze shifted to Ethan. "Unless, of course, you're planning to rely on more than neighborly assistance." The insinuation was clear. Julia felt her cheeks flush with anger, but before she could respond, Ethan stepped slightly forward. "Miss Calloway has retained Franklin Pierce as her attorney," he said evenly. "Any further communication should go through him." Bradford's expression hardened at the mention of Pierce. "You're involving yourself in matters that don't concern you, Northrop." "A neighbor being harassed concerns me," Ethan replied, his voice level but with steel beneath. especially when that harassment comes from a man who's already pushed too many small landholders out of this valley. For a tense moment, the two men stared at each other, an undercurrent of violence in the air. Julia noticed Harlow's hand drift toward his holstered pistol. "This isn't the time or place," Bradford finally said, breaking the standoff. "We'll let the law decide." With a curt nod to Julia, he turned and continued toward the bank, Harlow's cold eyes lingering on Ethan before he followed. "He's worried," Ethan observed quietly as they resumed walking. "Pierce's involvement changes things," Julia glanced at him. "You two have history." "Bradford has history with everyone who stands in his way," Ethan replied grimly. "But yes, we've had our disagreements. They completed their errands in town, quickly supplies from Mrs. Gardner's store, ammunition for Julia's rifle, seeds for fall planting." Throughout, Julia was aware of eyes following them, of conversations pausing as they passed. "Word travels fast," she commented as they loaded their purchases into her wagon. "Small towns," Ethan agreed. "By sundown, everyone will know you've hired Pierce and are fighting Bradford's claim." As they prepared to depart, Mrs. Gardner hurried from her store, pressing a package into Julia's hands. "Beef stew for your supper," she whispered, "and don't you worry about Bradford. Half the town is behind you." "Only half?" Julia asked with a wry smile. "The better half," Mrs. Gardner assured her with a wink. The return journey was more subdued than their morning ride. Julia found herself wrestling with conflicting emotions, determination to fight for her inheritance, fear of losing everything before she had truly begun, and increasingly, confusion about her feelings for the quiet man riding beside her. As they neared her homestead, Julia finally broke the silence. "Ethan, I need to ask you something." He turned to her, attentive. "Of course. Why are you helping me, truly? It can't simply be because I'm your neighbor or because you knew my uncle." Ethan was quiet for so long that Julia thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured. "When I first came to this valley, I was lost. The war had changed me. I couldn't go back to being the person my family expected, but I hadn't figured out who I was supposed to be instead." He gazed out at the mountains shimmering in the afternoon heat. "Your uncle saw something in me worth salvaging. He gave me purpose, taught me to work this land, to respect it. When he became ill, I promised him I'd look out for his property until his family claimed it." A pause. "But that's not the only reason." He turned to meet her eyes directly. "I'm helping you because I believe in what you're trying to do here, because I admire your courage in coming west alone, in facing men like Bradford without flinching. Because—" He hesitated, then finished simply, "because I care what happens to you, Julia." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning beyond their simplicity. Julia felt her heart beating faster, her breath catching slightly. "I care what happens to you too," she admitted softly. "More than I expected to care about anyone again after my parents died." Ethan's expression gentled. "We've both lost family," he observed. "Perhaps that's why we recognize something in each other." They had reached her yard now. Ethan dismounted first, coming around to help Julia down from the wagon. This time, as his hands circled her waist and he lifted her to the ground, there was a new awareness between them, his touch lingering a moment longer, her hands resting briefly on his shoulders. When her feet touched earth, they remained standing close, neither immediately stepping away. Julia could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes, the small scar near his temple, the subtle lines at the corners of his mouth that hinted at a smile seldom fully released. "I should help you unload," Ethan said finally, his voice rougher than usual. "Yes," Julia agreed, though neither moved immediately. The spell was broken by the sudden clucking of chickens from the coop, startled by some unseen disturbance. Ethan stepped back, clearing his throat, and the moment passed, leaving Julia with a curious mixture of disappointment and anticipation. They worked together to unload the supplies, their conversation returning to safer topics: the upcoming hearing, plans for the farm, the weather forecast for harvest. Yet something had shifted between them, A door opened that could not be fully closed again. As Ethan prepared to leave, he paused, one hand on his saddle. "The hearing is in 5 days," he said. "I'll come by each evening to help you prepare if that's all right." "I'd appreciate that," Julia replied, surprised by how much she meant it, not just for the practical assistance but for his presence, his company. Ethan nodded, studying her face as if committing it to memory. "Be careful, Julia," he said quietly. "Bradford won't stop with legal challenges if he thinks he's losing." With that warning, he mounted and rode away, leaving Julia standing in her yard with the afternoon sun warm on her face and a new, fragile hope taking root in her heart. The next 5 days passed in a whirlwind of activity. During the days, Julia worked tirelessly on her homestead, harvesting the first vegetables from her rejuvenated garden, cleaning and organizing the cabin, mending fences and tools. Each evening, Ethan arrived as promised, bringing documents from Pierce, coaching her on what to expect at the hearing, helping her organize her uncle's papers to strengthen her case. These evenings took on a pattern work and discussion by lamplight, then a simple shared meal, followed by conversation on the porch as twilight deepened. They spoke of their pasts, Ethan's privileged Boston upbringing, and the war experiences that had changed him forever. Julia's quiet life as a schoolteacher, and the fever epidemic that had claimed her parents along with a third of their small Pennsylvania town. Gradually, imperceptibly, the distance between them diminished. A brush of hands while passing documents, knees touching as they sat side by side reviewing maps, eyes meeting and holding for increasingly longer moments. Neither spoke of these changes directly, but both were acutely aware of the growing connection between them. On the evening before the hearing, Ethan brought unexpected news. "Pierce has uncovered Bradford's real plan," he said without preamble as Julia welcomed him onto the porch. "He's negotiating with the railroad." Julia stared at him, uncomprehending. "What does the railroad have to do with my land?" "Everything," Ethan replied grimly. "The territorial governor has approved a new spur line to connect the mining operations in the mountains with the main east-west route. They need a path through this valley and water access for the steam engines." Understanding dawned. "My uncle's land is directly in the proposed path," Ethan confirmed, "with the creek providing the water they need. If Bradford controls your property, he can sell right-of-way access to the railroad company for a fortune." Julia sank onto the porch step, stunned by this revelation. "How did Pierce discover this?" "He has connections in the territorial capital," Ethan explained, sitting beside her. "The plans aren't public yet, but Bradford has been meeting with railroad representatives for months." "No wonder he's so determined," Julia murmured. "It's not just about controlling the water or expanding his grazing land, it's about the railroad money." "Exactly." Ethan took her hand, his calloused palm warm against her skin. "But this information helps us. Bradford's been presenting himself as a rancher concerned about proper land management, but Pierce can expose his real motives." Julia nodded slowly, her mind racing. "The judge might not care about Bradford trying to take my land, but he might care about being manipulated for Bradford's financial gain." "That's what Pierce believes," Ethan agreed. "Bradford has cultivated many allies in town, but the railroad is controversial. Many local businesses fear it will bypass redemption entirely, turning the town into a ghost within years." They discussed the implications late into the evening, refining arguments and anticipating Bradford's tactics. Finally, as the moon rose high and bright above the mountains, Ethan reluctantly stood to leave. "You should rest," he said, looking down at Julia with concern. "Tomorrow will be difficult." Julia rose as well, suddenly aware of how close they were standing alone on her porch, the vast Wyoming night surrounding them like a protective cloak. "I'm not afraid," she said softly. "Not anymore." Ethan's expression softened as he studied her face in the silvery moonlight. "No," he agreed. "You're not the same woman who was afraid to walk into town that first day." I have you to thank for that, Julia said, for showing me I could belong here. Something changed in Ethan's eyes, a decision made, a barrier falling. Slowly, giving her every chance to withdraw, he raised one hand to gently touch her cheek. Julia, he said, her name almost a prayer on his lips. She leaned into his touch, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. Yes. Instead of answering with words, Ethan bent his head and kissed her softly at first, a question rather than a demand. Julia answered by raising her hands to his shoulders, drawing him closer as the kiss deepened into something that felt inevitable, necessary, like coming home after a long journey. When they finally parted, Ethan rested his forehead against hers, both of them breathing unsteadily. I've wanted to do that since the day I found you on the ridge, looking down at redemption, he confessed. Julia smiled, joy bubbling up inside her despite the challenges that awaited them tomorrow. I think I've wanted you to, she replied. Ethan reluctantly stepped back, though he kept hold of her hands. I should go, he said, his voice rough with emotion. But Julia, when this hearing is over, when your land is secure, we have things to discuss. Yes, she agreed, we do. He kissed her once more, briefly but with a promise of more to come, then descended the porch steps. As he mounted his horse, he turned back. Whatever happens tomorrow, remember you're not alone anymore. Julia watched him ride away, touching her fingers to lips that still tingled from his kiss. For the first time since her parents' deaths, she felt truly hopeful about the future, not just surviving, but potentially thriving, here in this wild, beautiful country. With this man who had walked beside her proudly when she needed it most. The courthouse in Redemption was crowded beyond capacity when Julia arrived the next morning. It seemed the entire town had turned out for the hearing, along with ranchers and farmers from throughout the valley. As she entered with Ethan and Pierce, the crowd parted, faces turning to watch their progress toward the front of the room. Bradford was already seated at one of the tables before the judge's bench, his attorney a sleek, well-dressed man from the territorial capital arranging papers beside him. Harlow leaned against the wall behind them, his cold eyes following Julia's movement. Quite the audience, Pierce murmured as they took their places at the second table. Good. The more witnesses, the less likely Wilson can simply rule in Bradford's favor without consequence. Judge Wilson entered from his chambers moments later, a corpulent man with a florid face and the perpetual expression of someone smelling something unpleasant. As the proceedings began, Julia found herself grateful for the solid presence of Ethan beside her, his quiet strength giving her courage. Bradford's case, presented first, focused on technicalities, questioning whether Thomas Calloway had been of sound mind when making his will, suggesting improprieties in how the deed had been transferred, even insinuating that Julia might not truly be Thomas's niece. His attorney spoke condescendingly of the impracticality of a woman managing valuable land alone, arguing that the territory's interests were best served by the property being in capable hands. Throughout, Julia maintained her composure, though her hands clenched tightly in her lap under the table. Beside her, she could feel Ethan's tension in the rigid set of his shoulders, the controlled stillness of his body. When Pierce rose to present their response, his approach was direct and devastating. He systematically demolished each technical argument with documentary evidence, the will properly witnessed and notarized, with Ethan and the town doctor as witnesses. Julia's birth records establishing her relationship to Thomas, letters between Thomas and his brother proving ongoing family connection. Then, just as Bradford's attorney began to look smugly confident despite these setbacks, Pierce introduced the railroad documents. Your Honor, he said, producing a sheaf of papers, these records show Mr. Bradford has been negotiating with the Territorial Railroad Commission for months, positioning himself to profit enormously from right-of-way access across land he does not yet own. Miss Calloway's inheritance. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Wilson's eyebrows rose as he accepted the documents. Where did you obtain these, Mr. Pierce? From the Territorial Secretary's office, Your Honor. They are public record, though not widely publicized. Pierce turned to face the crowded room. Mr. Bradford has presented himself as concerned about proper land management, but his true motive is financial gain at the expense of established landowners and the community as a whole. Bradford half rose from his seat, his face flushing with anger. This is irrelevant to the case at hand. On the contrary, Pierce countered smoothly, it speaks directly to motive and credibility. Mr. Bradford's challenge to Miss Calloway's inheritance is not based on legal concerns, but on his desire to acquire strategically valuable property for personal profit. The judge studied the railroad documents with a frown, occasionally glancing at Bradford, whose composure was visibly cracking. Finally, Wilson set the papers aside. I've heard enough, he announced. This court finds no merit in the challenge to Miss Calloway's inheritance. The will and deed transfer are valid and binding. Miss Calloway is the legal owner of the property in question. He banged his gavel once, definitively. Case dismissed. A cheer erupted from many in the crowd, the shopkeepers, smaller ranchers, and townspeople who had feared Bradford's growing influence. Julia sat stunned for a moment, relief washing through her so powerfully she felt lightheaded. Ethan's hand found hers under the table, squeezing gently. It's over, he murmured. You've won. Bradford rose abruptly, his face livid with barely controlled rage. He paused beside their table on his way out, leaning down to speak in a voice only they could hear. This isn't finished, he said coldly, not by a long shot. Before either could respond, he strode from the courtroom, Harlow following like a shadow. The threat lingered in the air despite the celebrations erupting around them. Pierce gathered his papers with a satisfied expression. Well done, Miss Calloway. Your uncle would be proud. Thank you, Julia said sincerely, shaking the lawyer's hand. I couldn't have done this without you. Or without Ethan, Pierce added with a knowing look between them. He's been fighting Bradford's tactics longer than anyone. Outside the courthouse, Julia found herself surrounded by well-wishers, Mrs. Gardner enveloping her in a tearful hug, Pastor Matthews offering congratulations, even Jim Harper, the mail carrier, tipping his hat respectfully. It was overwhelming, this sudden sense of belonging, of community. Throughout, Ethan remained at her side, a steady presence amid the commotion. His hand occasionally brushed hers, his eyes finding hers in moments of shared understanding. When they finally extricated themselves from the crowd and began the journey back to Julia's homestead, a weight seemed to have lifted from both of them. The future stretched before them, uncertain but full of possibility. What will you do now? Ethan asked as they rode side by side along the familiar trail. Live, Julia replied simply. Build the life my uncle started, plant crops, raise animals, make the land productive. She glanced at him. And you, will you continue as my neighbor? Ethan was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. I'd like to be more than your neighbor, Julia, he finally said, direct as always. Julia's heart quickened. What exactly did you have in mind, Mr. Northrop? A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, that rare, transformative smile she had come to treasure. I'm not a man who believes in wasting time once he knows his mind, he said. The war taught me that life is too uncertain for hesitation. He guided his horse closer to hers, reaching across to take her hand. I know we've known each other only a short while, he continued, but I feel as though I've been waiting for you without knowing it. You're brave and determined and kind, and being with you makes me feel whole in a way I haven't since before the war. Julia's throat tightened with emotion. Ethan, let me finish, he said gently. I'm not asking for an answer today. I'm asking for your permission to court you properly, to see if what's growing between us might become something lasting. I believe it could, Julia. I believe we could build something good together. Joy welled up within her, bright and unexpected. I'd like that very much, she replied, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. I came west seeking only survival, but I've found something I never expected, a place where I belong and someone to belong with. Ethan's expression softened with relief and happiness. Impulsively, he leaned across the space between their horses and kissed her a brief, sweet affirmation of possibilities to come. They continued toward home, her home now, truly and legally, with lightness in their hearts, despite Bradford's lingering threat. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. As they crested the final ridge overlooking Julia's property, they drew their horses to a halt, staring in horror at the scene below. Smoke rose from the cabin's roof, flames visible through the windows. The barn door hung open, her chickens scattered across the yard in panic, and her milk cow was nowhere to be seen. "Bradford," Ethan growled, his expression hardening from tenderness to fury in an instant. Without hesitation, they urged their horses forward, racing down the slope toward the burning homestead. As they neared, Julia could see that the fire was concentrated on the cabin's roof, and one wall not yet consuming the entire structure, but spreading rapidly. Ethan leapt from his horse before it had fully stopped. "The well," he shouted. "Get buckets." Julia dismounted and ran for the pump behind the house, grabbing the bucket she kept there. For the next frantic minutes, they worked in desperate tandem, Julia pumping water and filling buckets, Ethan carrying them to the cabin and climbing onto the porch roof to douse the flames. Smoke stung Julia's eyes and throat as she worked, fear and rage propelling her beyond exhaustion. This was her home, her future, her inheritance, and Bradford thought he could simply destroy it because he couldn't legally take it from her. Gradually, other riders appeared, Ethan's foremen and ranch hands, alerted by the smoke visible for miles in the clear air. With their help, the fire was finally contained, then extinguished, leaving the cabin standing but severely damaged. The roof would need extensive repair, and one wall was charred through in places. As Julia surveyed the damage, Pete approached, holding the reins of her milk cow. "Found her wandering toward the creek," he explained. "Looks like someone deliberately let her out." Miguel appeared from the barn, his expression grim. "They took some things, señorita," he reported. "Tools, seed bags, your winter preserves from the cellar." "Not just destruction," Ethan observed darkly. "They wanted to make it impossible for you to stay through the winter." Julia felt cold despite the lingering heat from the fire. "Bradford, almost certainly," Ethan agreed, "though Harlow would have done the actual work." "Bradford never dirties his own hands." Julia looked around at her damaged homestead, the cabin with its partially collapsed roof, the scattered chickens, the emptied cellar. Weeks of work destroyed in hours, supplies that had cost her precious savings stolen or ruined. For a moment, despair threatened to overwhelm her. Then she felt Ethan's hand on her shoulder, solid and reassuring. "We'll rebuild," he said simply. "All of us together." Julia looked up to see Ethan's men nodding in agreement, their faces determined. These were people who understood hardship, who had faced setbacks and persevered. Her people now. "Yes," she agreed, straightening her shoulders. "We will." The next weeks passed in a blur of activity. True to his word, Ethan brought his entire crew to help rebuild Julia's cabin, replacing damaged roof beams, reshingling, repairing the charred wall. Word spread through the community, bringing more assistance. Mrs. Gardner arrived with a wagon of supplies donated by townspeople. The pastor organized a work party to rebuild the barn door and chicken coop. Even Jim Harper contributed, bringing building materials at a discount when he returned from his next mail run to the territorial capital. Throughout, Bradford remained conspicuously absent, though rumors circulated that he was furious about the community's response to the fire. Harlow was seen watching from a distance once or twice, but never approached the property. "He's planning something else," Ethan warned as they sat on Julia's newly rebuilt porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. "Bradford doesn't give up easily." "Let him try," Julia replied with more confidence than she truly felt. He's shown his true nature to everyone now. Even Judge Wilson can't ignore arson and theft. Ethan took her hand, his thumb gently tracing circles on her palm. Just be vigilant. Don't go far from the homestead alone. These weeks also saw the deepening of their relationship. Ethan rode over each evening after completing work on his own ranch, sometimes bringing small gifts, a book he thought she'd enjoy, honey from his hives, wildflowers gathered along the way. They talked for hours, learning each other's stories, dreams, fears. Occasionally, he would stay for supper, and afterward they would sit on the porch, watching stars appear while sharing comfortable silences or quiet conversation. Sometimes he would kiss her sweet, increasingly passionate kisses that left Julia dizzy with wanting and eager for the future they were building together. By early October, the cabin was fully repaired, the garden harvested, and preparations for winter well underway. Julia had managed to replace most of the stolen supplies through her own work and the community's generosity. The railroad plans had been publicly announced, causing the division Bradford had feared. Many in town opposed the route that would bypass redemption, while others saw opportunity in the changes it would bring. On a crisp autumn morning, Julia was splitting kindling behind the cabin when she heard riders approaching. Setting down her axe, she moved to the corner of the building, wary after the fire incident. Relief washed through her as she recognized Ethan's tall figure on horseback, but it quickly turned to concern when she saw his expression and the urgency in his posture. Behind him rode Pete, equally grim-faced. "What's happened?" Julia asked as Ethan dismounted. "Bradford's making his move," Ethan replied without preamble. "He's brought in 20 hired guns from Colorado. They're camped at his north range, but Pete's seen them scouting this direction." Cold fear settled in Julia's stomach. 20 men, against what, just us? "Not just us," Pete interjected. "Word spreading. Smaller ranchers are gathering at Ethan's place. They know if Bradford can run you off with force, they'll be next." Ethan took Julia's hands in his. "I need you to pack essential items and come to my ranch," he said. "It's more defensible and we'll have numbers there. Leave my home." Julia pulled back, indignant. "After everything we've done to rebuild, just temporarily," Ethan insisted, "until we can resolve this. Bradford's men are professional gunmen, Julia. This isn't a fight you can win alone." She knew he was right, but the thought of abandoning her uncle's homestead, even briefly, felt like a betrayal of everything she had fought for. "There must be another way. The law," Pete suggested. "Territory's got a marshal in Cheyenne. If we could get word to him about Bradford bringing in hired guns across state lines." Ethan nodded slowly. "That might work. Marshal Davis is no friend of Bradford's, but it would take days for a message to reach Cheyenne and for Davis to respond." "Days we might not have," Julia concluded grimly. They were still discussing options when the sound of more approaching riders drew their attention. Julia's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle leaning against the porch, but Ethan shook his head, listening. "Too many horses," he said quietly. "Stay behind me." A group of riders appeared around the bend in the road, 10 men at least, with Bradford and Harlow at their lead. They were all armed, rifles resting across saddles, revolvers visible at their sides. Behind them, a cloud of dust suggested more riders following. Ethan and Pete moved to stand protectively in front of Julia as the group reined in at the edge of the yard. Bradford sat his horse with arrogant ease, surveying the homestead with cold eyes. "Northrop," he called, "this doesn't concern you. My business is with Miss Calloway." "Any threat to my neighbors concerns me," Ethan replied evenly, though Julia could see the tension in his stance. "Especially when that threat involves imported gunmen." Bradford smiled thinly. "I've simply hired additional hands for the fall roundup. If they happen to be skilled with firearms, well, the territory can be dangerous." Julia stepped forward, ignoring Ethan's warning glance. "What do you want, Mr. Bradford?" "The same thing I've wanted from the beginning, Miss Calloway, your land." Bradford's pretense at civility dropped away. The Railroad Commission has approved the route. Construction begins in spring. Your property stands in the way of progress and profit. The court has ruled, Julia reminded him. The land is legally mine. Courts change their minds, Bradford replied dismissively. Or sometimes properties change hands through other means. His gaze moved meaningfully to the repaired section of roof, the rebuilt barn door. Julia felt cold fury rising within her. You think you can intimidate me into selling after you burned my home and stole my supplies? I think, Bradford said slowly, that you're an intelligent woman who recognizes when she's outmatched. I have 20 experienced gunmen at my disposal. The nearest law is days away, and while Northrop here might have a few loyal hands, they're cattlemen, not fighters. As if on cue, more riders appeared behind Bradford's group, another half-dozen men with hard faces and well-worn weapons. The threat was unmistakable. I'm offering you one last chance, Bradford continued. $10,000 for the property, far more than it's worth as mere grazing land. Take the money and return east where you belong, or stay and face consequences I can't be responsible for. Before Julia could respond, the sound of yet more approaching riders echoed from the direction of town. All heads turned as a large group appeared on the road, at least 30 men on horseback, with Mrs. Gardner's wagon bringing up the rear. At their head rode Franklin Pierce, the lawyer, looking decidedly uncomfortable on horseback, but determined nonetheless. Beside him was Pastor Matthews, and behind them came shopkeepers, farmers, small ranchers, and ordinary townspeople from Redemption, all armed, all grim-faced. Seems we're having a community gathering, Pierce called as they approached. Hope we're not interrupting. Bradford's face darkened with anger. This is a private business matter, Pierce. Is it? The lawyer guided his horse forward, positioning himself beside Ethan, because it looks remarkably like an armed intimidation of a legal property owner. The kind of thing Territorial Marshal Davis might take an interest in. Davis is in Cheyenne, Harlow spoke for the first time, his voice cold. Not anymore, came a new voice as a rider pushed through the crowd from town. Jim Harper, the mail carrier, guided his horse into the open space between the two groups. Behind him rode a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a marshal's badge. Marshal Davis, Bradford acknowledged, his confidence visibly faltering. This is unexpected. I received some concerning reports, Davis replied, his voice carrying easily across the tense gathering. Armed men crossing from Colorado, threats against legitimate landowners, talk of forcing property sales. His hard gaze fixed on Bradford. The kind of reports that make a territorial marshal ride through the night to investigate. Julia realized with a start that Jim Harper must have taken it upon himself to alert the marshal after their earlier conversation. The mail carrier caught her eye and gave a slight nod, confirming her suspicion. These men work for me, Bradford insisted, gesturing to his gunmen. There's no law against hiring hands. No, Davis agreed. But there are laws against intimidation, arson, theft, and conspiracy to deprive citizens of their legal property. He straightened in his saddle. I'm placing you under arrest, Bradford, you and Harlow both, pending investigation. For a moment, it seemed Bradford might resist. His eyes darted between his hired guns and the marshal, calculating odds. But the presence of so many townspeople supporting Julia, ordinary citizens willing to stand against him, seemed to finally penetrate his arrogance. This is a mistake, he said stiffly. My lawyers will have this sorted out within days. Perhaps, Davis acknowledged, but in the meantime you'll be guests of the territorial authority. He gestured to two deputies who had ridden in with him. Disarm them. As Bradford and Harlow were taken into custody, their hired gunmen looked uncertainly at one another, clearly assessing whether to intervene. Marshal Davis addressed them directly. Any man who interferes with legal arrest will face similar charges, he announced. Those of you from Colorado would be wise to return there immediately. Wyoming Territory has no need of imported troublemakers. One by one, Bradford's men turned their horses and departed, unwilling to risk their freedom for an employer who could no longer pay them. Within minutes, only the townspeople, Ethan's men, and the marshal's group remained. Julia stood in stunned silence, the sudden resolution of the threat almost too much to comprehend. Beside her, Ethan released a long breath, the tension visibly draining from his shoulders. "It's over," he said quietly. "Really over this time." As the crowd began to disperse, with many stopping to offer congratulations or support, Julia found herself overwhelmed with gratitude. These people, many of whom she had known for only weeks, had risked their safety to protect her and her property. It was a kind of belonging she had never expected to find. Mrs. Gardner descended from her wagon, enveloping Julia in a motherly hug. "We weren't about to let Bradford drive you out," she declared. "This community stands together." Marshal Davis approached after securing his prisoners in the wagon that would transport them back to town. "Miss Calloway," he said, tipping his hat. "I apologize it came to this before official intervention was possible." "Thank you for coming so quickly," Julia replied sincerely. "Thank Harper," Davis responded with a nod toward the mail carrier. "He rode all night to reach me, then turned around and guided me back without rest." He glanced at Ethan, then back to Julia with a knowing look. "You have loyal friends here." As the marshal's party departed with their prisoners, the remaining townspeople helped clean up the yard, which had been churned to mud by so many horses. Mrs. Gardner insisted on staying to prepare a meal for everyone, commandeering Julia's kitchen with cheerful efficiency. By late afternoon, only Ethan remained, the two of them finally alone on the porch as the autumn sun began its descent toward the mountains. "I still can't quite believe it," Julia admitted, watching the golden light play across the valley. "That so many people would stand with us. You've become important to them," Ethan said simply, "as they have to you." Julia turned to study his face, the strong lines softened by the evening light, the green eyes that had first caught her attention that day on the ridge above town. "And you?" she asked softly. "How important have I become to you, Ethan Northrop?" Ethan's expression grew serious, tender. He took her hands in his touch gentle yet firm. "Essential," he replied, the single word carrying the weight of his feeling. "As necessary as water, as air." He drew a deep breath, seeming to gather his courage. "I know it hasn't been long, Julia. Some might say too short a time to know one's heart, but I've never been more certain of anything." His eyes held her steadily. "I love you. I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." Joy bloomed in Julia's chest, bright and overwhelming. "I love you too," she whispered, the words she had been holding back for weeks finally released. "I didn't expect to find you here at the end of such a long journey, but now I can't imagine my life without you in it." Ethan's smile transformed his face, years of solitude and struggle falling away in the light of their shared happiness. He drew her to her feet and into his arms, holding her as if she were precious beyond measure. "Marry me," he said against her hair. "Not immediately, I know you value your independence, your own place, but someday soon. Let me walk beside you proudly for the rest of our days." Julia leaned back to look into his face, her heart full to bursting. "Yes," she replied simply. "Yes to all of it." Their lips met in a kiss that felt like a promise, a beginning, a homecoming. Around them, the Wyoming twilight settled gently over the land. They both loved her inheritance become their shared future, stretching before them with infinite possibility. 3 years later, Julia stood on the porch of the expanded cabin, watching as Ethan taught their 1-year-old daughter Emma to take tentative steps across the yard. The little girl's delighted giggles carried on the spring breeze as her father's strong hands supported her wobbly progress. So much had changed since that day when Bradford had been arrested. The rancher had eventually been convicted of multiple crimes and his empire dismantled, his lands divided among smaller operators who had previously been forced out. Harlow had fled the territory before trial, last rumored to be in Montana. The railroad had ultimately chosen an alternate route that benefited redemption while respecting existing property rights. The town was growing steadily, with new businesses opening and families arriving to settle the fertile valley. Julia and Ethan had married that first Christmas, in a ceremony at the little church in town attended by what seemed like the entire community. They had decided to maintain both properties, his larger ranch and her homestead, eventually connecting them with a well-traveled path and shared operations. Julia had taken over the town's school after the previous teacher retired, riding in 3 days a week to educate the growing number of children while continuing to develop the farm with Ethan. Their daughter had been born the previous spring, bringing a joy neither had fully anticipated into their already happy lives. As she watched her husband and child in the golden afternoon light, Julia felt a profound gratitude for the journey that had brought her west the fear and grief that had ultimately led to such unexpected happiness. Ethan looked up, catching her eye across the yard. His smile, once so rare, now came easily and often. He whispered something to Emma, then guided her in Julia's direction, the toddler's face alight with determination as she wobbled toward her mother. "She's determined to reach you," Ethan called. Just like her mother, once she sets her mind to something, there's no stopping her. Julia descended the porch steps, kneeling to welcome her daughter's approach. "That determination is what brought me here," she reminded him, "when I was afraid to walk into town that first day." Ethan reached them as Emma collapsed laughing into Julia's arms. He knelt beside them, gathering both his wife and daughter into an embrace. "And I promised to walk beside you proudly," he remembered, "the best promise I ever made." Julia leaned into his strength, the perfect circle of their family complete in that moment. Around them, their joined properties flourished, fields ready for spring planting, orchards beginning to blossom, cattle grazing peacefully on the hillsides. This was her true inheritance. Julia realized not just the land her uncle had left her, but the love and community she had found in this wild, beautiful country. A place where a woman once afraid to walk alone had found the courage to build a life, a home, and a family with the man who had promised to walk beside her proudly, and had kept that promise every day since.